Chemnitz, Germany, November 21st. Paint peeled off the swing set in the front yard, yellow flakes drifting like sunburnt snow to dead grass. No wind had stirred for some time. The air smelled of rank summer sweat, still and stagnant, seeping out of the parched soil. There were no birds in the barren trees. A nightmare had come to town. It walked down the road with methodical pacing, a long cloak swaying gently with each footfall. The worn machete on its belt clanked against armored gloves. No hint of skin or hair suggested it was human. Overlapping layers of cloth, metal, and rubber took care of that. The mask over its face hissed softly, taking in air to process. In every way, inhuman. From behind cracks in shuttered windows, anxious eyes watched it pass, breaths held until it was safely out of sight, superstitiously certain it could smell fear in the air. There weren't many to see it this day. Some houses had long open doors. Others were boarded shut with black paint splashed from afar. A ghost town, by will or fortune. The chain fence around number 37 was untouched, a lone tire leaning precariously against its gate, the closest anyone dared come. From a tiny half-frosted window in the door, Kurt saw the thing pause at the end of the walkway. He swallowed slowly, adjusting his view to see better. It was staring right at him. It rolled the tire away, carefully leaning it against the fence post, and unlatched the gate. Halfway up the interlocked stone path, the thing stopped, turned, and stared at the cross in the lawn. 4 graves beneath its soft shadow, all roughly dug in the cold November soil. Nothing moved for some time, and Kurt gripped the trim around his small portal with bloodied fingernails, waiting. Finally, the thing turned away from the graves, climbed the steps to the porch, and without a pause, opened the front door. Kurt stumbled backwards into the foyer, falling against the banister as the dark figure stopped before him. Kurt stammered, his voice weak and creaky. "Are you?" The thing looked at him without emotion. Air hissed. "Are you a healer?" Kurt gasped. It watched him a moment, then carefully bowed a yes. Kurt collapsed down on the steps, covering his head with his frail, empty arms, and began to sob. He heard the soft crunch of thick boots grinding dirt into the Persian rug. He hesitated, looked up, saw the mask, his reflection in the dark oval goggles. He looked so worn. The healer held out a hand to him, and he took it, stood and let himself be led into the living room. He sat in his father's soft armchair, awkwardly, like a stranger in his own home, being hosted by someone who'd only just arrived. The healer sat on the sofa to the right and removed 2 cloth packages from a pouch on his belt, one blue, one black. He placed them gently on the coffee table and unrolled the black one to reveal a small plastic device and an assortment of vials. Kurt closed his eyes, shuddering. The healer put a long vial into the base of the device, clicking it into place. Kurt studied every move with his arms pulled close to his chest, like a child expecting a shot at the doctor. When it was time to draw his blood, Kurt's face was already streaked with tears. The healer didn't force him, but it was clear there was no escaping it. Kurt exhaled loudly, held out a trembling arm, and the healer's hand gripped his elbow firmly. A quick sting shot through him as a tiny blade hit, and he yelped, closing his eyes tightly as his blood filled the vial. His elbow jerked free, a cotton swab pushed against the wound. The healer slid a panel down on the device to reveal a small LCD screen. Kurt looked out the front windows, saw the tip of the cross on the lawn, and just stared. It was like the room was empty again, and he was alone there, sitting, watching, waiting for a resolution. Absolution. The creak of rubber beside him shook the daydream away. They died because of me, he asked, not so much a question as a need for confirmation. The healer didn't shift his gaze from the device, and the callousness of it pushed Kurt into hysteria. He grabbed the monster's wrist, thick with metal, shook it, and got the attention he needed. "They died because of me," he shouted. The healer placed a hand atop Kurt's, squeezed gently, and he calmed, his breathing ragged but slow. Was it me?" he whispered. A moment passed where neither moved, as if the answer had to be read from the air rather than repeated as fact. But then, the healer nodded. "No!" Kurt screamed, curling against the chair. He cried again until he had no air in his lungs at all and gasped a horrible, raspy breath against the floral fabric, like he was drowning out of water. He felt the cold tap of metal against his neck, a hiss and a sting, and his eyes shot open at the shock of it. He pushed his face into the cushions, stopped his theatrics, and started to mouth a prayer in his last few seconds. A fire shot through his veins, and he flailed back onto the floor, convulsing so hard he bit the edge off his tongue. He gagged on the blood. A strong hand pushed down on his chest, keeping him from rolling, and in the moments before his vision gave out, he saw the healer over him, an expressionless mask, watching. "Not your fault," it said to him in a rough, processed voice from the darkness. On his way out of the house, the healer closed the door quietly, respectfully. As he made his way past the graves, he paused as harsh static struck his ears. "Home to Green 4, came a voice, Mandarin Chinese distorted by an overcast sky, as if spoken through a digital waterfall. "Do you copy, Green 4? The healer took the heavy satellite phone from his belt, unfolded the antenna, then let it hang by his side again. "Green 4 to home," he said, fluent in his native tongue. "Sigma 5 is neutralized." A pause. Static again. "Understood," said Home. "We will send you the coordinates of a safe location to leave the blood sample." The healer nodded to the empty air. "Your next assignment is identified," said Home without a hint of emotion. "You will be leaving at once." The healer turned west, the afternoon sun nearly invisible in the haze. "Understood," he said again. "Profiles and identification algorithms will be sent to you en route. We have intelligence indicating a living host at the Motul Hospital in Prague." The healer stiffened slightly as the line devolved to static. He turned around, straight behind him, and stared into the darkening sky, back where night was already falling. He turned a bit more, southeast. "Home," he said carefully, deliberately. "I am already west of Prague. Please confirm." Static. The faint sounds of a discussion away from a microphone. "Confirmed, Green 4, came the reply. "Maps and speaking guides will be relayed before you cross the border." The healer glanced back towards the setting sun, then stared headlong toward his objective. A weak wind tugged his cloak, and a speck of rain hit his mask between his eyes. His suit whined faintly, warning of moisture contact, gently quieting as the drops slid down and away. He did not react. "Understood," he said once more. Another raindrop glanced off his shoulder. He was stirred back to life at the sound of the incendiary grenade exploding in the house behind him. He retracted his steps down the interlocked path, opening the front gate as the black smoke started to pour out of the windows and into the sky above. He left the tire as he'd found it. Outside Prague, Czech Republic, November 26th. Another raindrop hit the train's window and dripped slowly downward. Ava watched it, her head against the glass, as the sky darkened. She shivered in the cold, pulling her thinning denim jacket tighter, her arms substituting for the buttons, long since torn from the front. Her tank top was too threadbare and worn for this weather, but she had no bags, no clothes to change into. She peered down the side of the train as far as she could, but saw no movement. The fields outside were abandoned, half-turned soil waiting for another pass with a tractor. 40 minutes, she muttered to herself, checking her watch. She looked back the way they'd come, saw nothing there but hostile sky. A knock at the door startled her. She sat straight, adjusted her jacket, and tried to fix her poorly bundled hair. The door opened a moment later, and a uniformed officer with a surgeon's mask entered the suddenly cramped compartment. He took a quick look around, but seemed bored by the action, like he'd done it one too many times before. Ava tried not to move, keeping a smile on her face that felt fake no matter how she adjusted it. The officer made no attempt to establish eye contact, only said gruffly in Czech, "Ticket, passport, photo identification." Ava slid a small, worn manila envelope from her right breast pocket, holding out the contents with shaking hands. The officer took the papers and cards, running them through his handheld with casual expertise. He nodded toward her jacket as he worked. "Not the safest place to keep these things," he said. "I know," she replied, nodding anxiously. "Stolen passports go for, what, 65,000 euros in Barcelona?" 85, Ava began, then stopped abruptly, staring at the ground. She heard the officer pause his work. She tried not to shiver during the awkward silence. "You should get a better jacket," he said, and the work resumed. "I will," Ava said, relaxing a bit but still on guard. "It's been a long trip." "I can see that," he muttered, flipping through the pages of her passport. He turned it sideways, flicked his eyes over at her, then snapped it shut and slipped it underneath the handheld while he worked on her health card. "You look young for 23, he remarked, though he wasn't looking at her. Thank you," she stammered. "It's not a compliment. Under the circumstances, nothing I say is going to be a compliment. Let's see your eyes." She looked up at him, nervous. He squinted at her. "Nice shade of blue." "What's that?" "Azure?" "I think it's called Brandeis, actually." "Really? Never heard of that before." "It's funny, the odd facts and trivia you learn from these encrypted health cards." There was an awkward silence. "A border guard in Switzerland told me," Ava said. The officer cocked an eyebrow. "What else did he tell you?" "That I looked old for 21. The guard smiled at this, but it wasn't a warm smile. He had very hard features, and the mask didn't sit well on his face. The metal bridge for the nose was snapped in half, where he'd tried to reshape it too often, and the spaces around the sides fogged his glasses in slow, steady bursts as he breathed. "Ms. Kolikoff," said the officer, gruffly but wearily, like he was repeating a lecture for the 1,000th time. "Your passport is Russian. Your name is Russian. And unless you're going to claim you've been living under a rock until recently, I'm pretty sure you know the Czech Republic closed its borders over 2 years ago. especially to our cousins in Russia. Ava lowered her gaze, appropriately chastised. The officer continued. Unspoken policy says we don't even do the small talk with people who carry Russian passports. Last guy who did ended up dying from boils the size of a fist on his neck because, and I don't mean to generalize, even though you people started it, you still don't seem to grasp how big a shitstorm it's become. Don't know when to quit, and we're sick of trying to make you understand. Like spitting into the wind. Now, I could list you about 15 regulations covering the rights of refugees and amnesty claimants as they relate to UN containment policies. But the bottom line is this. I'm fully within my rights to grab you by the scruff of the neck and toss you off this train before you even have a chance to think of a way to convince me otherwise. Ava held her breath. The officer scrolled his handheld briefly. This is the part where you convince me otherwise, he sighed. Oh, Ava stammered. Well, I used to have dual citizenship, so while I'm not technically Czech anymore, my mother is. She lives in Prague right now, and You've been in Paris, he interrupted. Ava nodded. A few years ago, at school. Computer science, noted the officer. No, fine arts, Eva corrected. Says here, computer science. I switched majors. He glanced at her again, eyes unflinching. Computer science in Paris is all I see. Let's move on. I haven't been in Paris for years. You can check my passport. I left before. Ms. Kolikoff, said the officer, staring her down. Your mom's a citizen. You cleared the first hurdle. Congratulations. Now trust me when I say this. If you are lucky enough to continue on this train, you will want to have saved your impassioned speeches for the immigration agents at the station. Words don't change your documents, and from here on out, all we care about are your doc. He trailed off, frowned at the screen, and looked back at her sharply. She froze, unsure what he'd read. He pocketed her ID and his handheld, leaned out the door, and called down the hallway. What's a 17.5? He said, his voice scratchy when loud. There was a brief pause, some clattering, then a voice mumbled something back that Ava couldn't make out. The officer sighed, leaned further out the door, cupped his hand to his mask, and shouted again. What's a 17.5? He glanced back at Ava, then walked out of her cabin, sliding the door half closed, and disappeared down the hall. She was left there with no papers, painfully alone in a space meant for four. The wind outside was picking up, and the sky was darker still. A sudden scream from the hallway broke her stare. She turned around to see a woman being shoved down the narrow passage. The officers on either side kept pushing her forward, their faces cold behind creased masks. The woman grabbed the bar outside Ava's door and tried to resist, but the larger of the two officers planted a hand on her face and pushed so hard it seemed as if her neck might break. The woman reached inside her jacket and pulled out a passport, a Euro ID card, tried to hand them back. One of the officers smacked them out of her hand onto the ground, as if they meant nothing to him. They meant everything to her. She gasped in horror, lost her grip, and was pushed out of view. Ava carefully leaned closer to the door, trying to see where they'd gone. She heard the echo of screaming, frantic banging, and then the sound of the heavy doors to the train slamming shut. The woman's passport lay on the rug in the hall, cover bent and tread upon. Bulgarian. Ava glanced out the window again, felt the cold through her jacket more intensely now. She touched her empty pocket, bit her lip. A long way home, she said to herself, then risked another peek at the passport. her hands clasped together, white fingertips trembling, working up the nerve to snatch another lifeline. It would only take a second to pull it in. All it would take is a second, and she'd have a backup plan after months of... A knock at the hallway window jolted her back to attention. The officer had returned, holding her passport and wrapping the glass again with scarred knuckles. "Up!" he called. Ava quickly obeyed, slipping out of the cabin without a word. The officer watched her with callous eyes, squinting unhappily. He grabbed her chin and turned her towards him, making sure he had her attention. He waved her passport, health card, and ticket like a magician about to perform a trick, then shoved them into her pocket. Ava flinched at the contact. Her jaw was aching from being clenched so long. "Back of the train," he said, shoving her slightly. She caught her balance just in time, stared at him desperately. "What's at the back of the train?" "Quarantine," he said coldly, thumbing the safety off his pistol. Outside Prague, Czech Republic, November 26th. "Wait," Ava pleaded as the officer closed in. "I'm Czech." He aimed the gun squarely at her head. "I've got 40 other so-called Czechs back there who say the same thing." Ava's face lost color. 40? She gasped. "But if one of them is sick, less paperwork for me," he grunted. Ava bumped into the wall. The officer half smirked, like he was begging her to make a move, so he'd have an excuse to shoot. There was nothing to fight back with, nowhere to run, and no hope if she tried. She slowly raised her hands above her head. There was a flash of movement, and suddenly a pair of arms wrapped around his neck from behind, pulling him back and off balance. He thrashed to the side, swung a fierce elbow back into his assailant's stomach, but still couldn't get free. He was slammed into the wall, cracking the window to the compartment, but not giving up his gun. He swung his elbow back again, once, twice, and the third blow connected with a crack. The grip on his neck loosened, and he pulled forward, free, face red with fury and stress. Ava's fist hit him so hard he slammed into the wall. For a moment, he had a look of confusion, like it didn't make sense what had just happened. But only for a moment. She finished him off with a blow to the face. He collapsed to the ground, glasses broken, eyes rolling and shut. Ava looked up, saw a lean, scruffy man with ruffled blonde hair, wincing at the pain in his ribs. "Where'd you learn to do that?" he grunted. "Here and there," she smiled. "Thanks, I think." "Don't take it personal." He grinned, crouching quickly, scooping the gun out of the guard's limp hand and giving it a once-over appraisal. "He'd be getting to me next, and I'm not even Czech. You coming?" She glanced down at the unconscious guard, then to the back of the train. "Not much choice anymore, is there?" "Great. I'm Anton, by the way." "Ava," she said. Anton smiled back, then took off on a skittish, exploratory journey down to the heavy doors at the middle of the train. A bright yellow sign warned them not to leave until they were sure it was safe outside. A friendly biohazard symbol served as the point below a question mark. "I hope you like walking." Anton beamed and pulled the door open, just a crack at first. The cold air beat Ava in the face, making her squint. The rain was coming down fiercely now, the horizon a blurry mess of heavily slanted sleet pounding into the farmland. Anton saw it first. He gripped Ava's hand tighter. The Bulgarian woman in the fur coat was backing away from the two guards who had shoved her outside. They had their pistols aimed, but the way they were closing in on her said they were doing more than just threatening. The woman turned to run, covering only a few meters before 2 shots rang out, and she dropped to the ground in a heap, her coat spread out in the mud like the wings of an angel. "Oh shit," Ava and Anton said at once. The guards turned back, holstering their weapons, but paused at the sight of the open door. The gruff one reacted faster, his eyes wide as he charged at them, drawing his gun and taking aim. "Don't move!" he shouted, and Anton slammed the door, throwing down the locking bolt just as a loud thump hit it. He and Ava dashed back to the unconscious officer, who was on the verge of waking up when Anton viciously kicked him across the head and into the wall. "What are we going to do?" Ava asked. "I don't know yet," Anton said, glancing up and down the corridors. "Let me know if you think of something. Now come on." He took off towards the front of the train, Ava close behind. The other passengers watched them go, some looking ahead, some looking back, waiting for the guards to calm the insurrection. None made a move to follow them. Ava and Anton ducked into a small compartment at the rear of a car, closing the door and flicking on the lights. He started rifling through cupboards like mad, dropping food packets, sterile pillows, and ceiling tape all over the ground as Ava peeked outside, trying to hear signs of trouble. "Why are they shooting people?" Anton hissed. "Whatever happened to deporting?" "Borders wide open," Ava replied. "You get thrown off the train. What'll you do? Give up and go home, or finish the trip on foot?" "I guess," he conceded. "The only way for them to be certain is to make sure we don't make it anywhere on foot. I should have known this would happen when they didn't do the check at the border. We're too close to Prague to just boot us out."
"How far do you think it is?"
Eva shrugged. "Close enough to try." Anton let out a gasp of joy and yanked a pair of heavy brown wool blankets from a low drawer, folding them over and tucking one under his arm. He shoved the other at Ava. "Take this and move fast," he said, pushing his way out into the corridor, glancing back briefly before racing down to the end of the car to another outside door. "I have them!" came a distant shout. Anton angrily slammed a fist against the wall, then turned his attention to a ladder instead. "Let's go. Quick!" They climbed fast, up onto the slick steel roof. It was ridged to make it easier to scale, but the gentle curve was still steep enough that it was dangerously easy to fall, especially in this weather. Anton pointed back towards the tail end of the train. "We'll double back, get into the fields, muddy up the blankets, and stay put till they give up and leave." Gun in hand, he led Ava down the length of the train, rain raising a deafening roar all around them. It was so noisy she wouldn't know if someone were calling after them. Not until a gunshot, at least. But they were past the point of warning anyway, so she dashed forward, trying to keep her feet on course while the slick metal threatened disaster. She felt a quick tug at her arm, and in an instant, Anton was falling sideways off the train, smacking his shoulder before disappearing off the edge. Ava dropped to her knees and leaned over the side, watching him roll to a painful stop in a ditch by the muddy field. He reached desperately for the gun, which had fallen a short distance away. Behind her, guards were starting to get onto the roof, their loud shouts of coordination echoing past. She gripped her blanket tightly, and without pausing, jumped off the train, landing next to Anton. She flinched at the impact, feeling like her legs might have broken. "Anton!" she gasped, scuttling over to him. "Anton!" He got hold of the gun, wiped it across his shirt to clean off the mud, and lurched to his feet. "Blankets! Fast!" She shoved the blankets into the mud, dragging them around. Before she could get very far, Anton grabbed her by the arm and pulled her further into the field, past a watery pool. She let the blankets collect all the filth they could along the way. "We need them now," Anton called urgently. "Almost there," she shouted back, but he wasn't listening anymore. The guards had caught up with them, were starting to climb down ladders, urgent but confident. Anton checked the safety. "Leave my blanket. I'll catch up." "Anton, wait." But her voice was drowned out by 2 sharp shots as Anton clipped the closer guard in the thigh. He fell hard into the tracks, and his comrade quickly slung his gun out and fired wildly toward the escapees. Ava had cleared nearly 10 meters when she tripped into the mud with a splash. She checked behind herself to see if anyone had noticed, but all she saw when she looked was a quick image of Anton, cornered by the enemy, receiving a bullet to the chest and toppling backward. Outside Prague, Czech Republic, November 26th. Ava lay still, rain blurring her vision as the echo of the gunshot disappeared into the bitter air. She was shivering violently, whether from the cold or from fear, and she drew slow, ragged breaths to keep from sobbing. The blanket was beside her, disappearing into mud that was flowing free like a river, and she knew she too was sinking in, out of sight. Just how far? She couldn't tell. The guards were yelling back and forth to each other, terse military barks that she couldn't make out. 2 more skirted the roof of the train, looking out into the fields with guns drawn, hunting her. It was impossible to tell how much they could see, so she tried to shove herself further into the muck, to disappear. "Hey! He's still breathing!" came a shout from near the train, and Ava dared to look up that way. A pair of guards were standing over Anton, guns holstered. She couldn't see any movement, couldn't hear any signs of life, but all the same, she felt the pit of her stomach hollow out with terror. "We've got to move him," one said to the other. "I'm not touching that. He's bleeding all over the place." "We've got gloves." "Then you do it. Better yet, next time shoot him out in the field like you're supposed to." Ava heard a slosh close by and held her breath. Another slosh, and she could faintly hear the sound of feet trudging through the mud behind her. Slow, methodical, searching. She sunk her face lower, closed her eyes, and pushed as far down as she could until her nose was half submerged, pulling in foul-smelling filth every other breath. The footsteps stopped, but she heard the sound of sleet pounding a guard's waterproof jacket. "Listen," continued the guard near the train. "If we leave him here, people are going to see him, and we'll have a panic on our hands the last half hour of the trip." As if Holik's leg won't do that anyway, or the half-dozen gunshots they've all heard by now. The guard behind her was moving again, but she couldn't tell if he was coming or going. She became aware of the feeling of rain hitting her left calf directly, and realized the mud was flowing off her, that she was slowly becoming uncovered as she lay there. She tried to shift her leg until the mud wrapped around her, but then the footsteps stopped again. They were still close by. "Fine," grumbled the first guard. "One way or another, it's got to be done. Thanks a lot, though." Ava felt pressure on her right foot, the rough tread of a boot on her skin. She bit her lip to keep from making noise, felt her ankle scream with pain. Then, crack! A gunshot echoed out, and everything lost meaning. "Jesus!" gasped the first guard, and Ava swore she heard mad gurgling. The guard behind her leapt over her, giving her ankle one last crunch as he did. She whimpered into the mud, but it was quickly drowned out by the sound of another gunshot, then a quick series in return. "Jesus! Oh Christ, I'm hit!" wailed the first guard. Radios were buzzing all around, footsteps sprinting through water, and Ava heard the heavy doors to the train crash open. She peeked up over the mud, blinking back the rain. 1, 2, 3, up, called an officer, and the first guard was hauled up on a stretcher and carried to the door. She saw the other guard, propped up against a comrade, his eyes blank and a gushing wound in his neck. They closed his eyes and lifted him gently up and away. One of the younger guards spent a good 2 minutes sloshing the mud around with his foot, trying to hide the blood that had pooled there. Even when she was finally alone, Ava stayed perfectly silent in the rain, for longer than she could keep track of. The deluge didn't let up, kept pounding her bare head, so cold it was like tiny blades smashing into her skull. She looked ahead, tried to see Anton, see if he was still alive, though that wasn't likely anymore. She tried sliding forward on her stomach, crawling flat on the ground, but she knew it was too risky. She stopped, rested her head on the side, and waited. Then, after an unbearable wait, an older, senior-looking officer came out the door, trudged near where Anton had fallen, and lit a cigarette. He looked out into the field, right towards Ava, blowing smoke against the wind. A minute later, he was joined by the officer she'd beaten, his glasses gone, bruised face, an ice pack on the side of his head. He leaned against the train, looking winded. "All set," the hurt one said. "The cars are sectioned, and we're ready to move." "How's Carol?" "As long as he doesn't pick up anything, he should make it. We've got him in isolation with the doc." "Good. We'll get going once I finish this." There was a pause as Eva's officer looked out over the field, too. They stood there in silence, and Ava shivered at the thought she might be seen. "How about the girl?" her guard said. "She's 17.5, right?" "Yeah. Hadn't seen one of those before." The smoking officer stared out at the setting sun. His cigarette glowed brightly. "She's either dead or going to die. I'm not wasting any more lives on her." The other man nodded solemnly, then kept quiet for the time it took his superior to finish smoking and toss the butt into the mud. They climbed aboard the train, slammed the door shut, and within a few minutes, the train's engine roared back to life, and it started to slide down the tracks. Ava waited until it was a faint shimmer on the horizon before crawling to her feet. Her ankles seared with pain, but she kept walking on it until the sensation disappeared into her general discomfort. After a few kilometers, she was barely limping at all. The woman stood behind a fence near the train tracks, her wide hat drooping uselessly in the rain, a lantern by her side, sending light across the field as far as the weather allowed. She hadn't moved the entire time Ava had seen her there, and the only motion she made up close was to maintain lazy eye contact with the only other living creature for miles. She was gaunt, like a skeleton with a thin layer of skin holding it together. "Nice night for a walk," said the old woman as Ava passed by. Ava stopped, turned back. It was sometime after midnight, and she was bleary-eyed and shivering madly. "Excuse me?" She trembled. "No rain lately. This is good for the crops." Ava smiled weakly, nodded, started back on her way. "You're going to the city?" asked the woman, interrupting again. "I came from the city. Had a flat there, a nice big television. Watched imported films every Friday night. You ever seen Midnight Cowboy?" Ava shook her head. Me neither. It was top of the queue when my husband died. Moscow 9. Ava just watched. The old woman was talking more to herself now, fiddling her thumbs, staring at the ground as a waterfall poured off the brim of her hat. I couldn't go back. They sealed my flat, and I had nowhere else to go. My sister wouldn't see me. My parents wouldn't answer the phone. They may have been dead already. I'm not sure. It's always hard to tell. Another minute passed, with just the sound of the rain, and when Ava decided it was time to move on, the woman looked up at her directly. Are you good at farming? Sorry, what? Do you know anything about growing food? Keeping animals? Number. No, sorry, I don't. The woman nodded, looked back to the ground. I live in the barn, way back there. The farmhouse is sealed, tape all over. No idea why. I won't go in. But the barn is nice. I thought it was a waste of land, you know? All this land and no one alive to use it. Such a shame. I'm not very good at growing things. I need some help. Ava looked back, saw nothing in the darkness. No farmhouse, no barn, no crops. I'm going to stay with my mother. She's got a place in the city, Ava said. The woman nodded as if she'd expected it. That's good. That's very good, she muttered. Ava walked into the cold as the woman's voice trailed off behind her. Skipton House, London, England, November 27th. William Carey stubbed his toe on a concrete barrier, and his coffee promptly dumped itself all over the sidewalk. It took him a moment or two to fully process what had happened, by which point the hot liquid was well on its way to searing his hand. He threw it away in a hurry, cursing quietly under his breath. "Morning, Mr. Carey," said a patrolman, a tight rubber mask hiding a warm smile. "Trouble with your beverage, sir?" Carey smiled pathetically and shrugged. "I seem to lose them daily, don't I, Claude?" "That you do, sir." Carey wiped his trousers off with his free hand, his leather briefcase barely counterbalancing the effort. He stood up, sighed loudly, and pushed his wire-rimmed glasses up his nose. Luckily, there was no one else in the area to witness his disaster. Somewhere off in the distance, a lone motorbike zipped down another empty street, piercing the morning quiet and sending a storm of pigeons off the rooftops all around Skipton House. One day, I'll make it to my desk without tripping over things. Claude shrugged, then caught sight of a young woman in a gray skirt and a yellow wraparound mask on her way to work. She flashed him an ID badge as she passed, taking no notice of Carey at all. The two men watched her card swipe her way through the front doors and disappear inside. Carey's coffee-soaked clothes were starting to give him a chill. He wiped at them some more. "It's a waste of a good drink, is what it is," he grumbled. "You'd have to dump it out at the first checkpoint anyway, sir," Claude said, checking down the street like he was waiting to get on with more important business. "Number really?" "Yes, sir. No outside substances past checkpoint A." "Oh dear, I guess I never got far enough to find out about that rule." "Yes, sir." Carey began staring at the ground, embarrassed, shifting the briefcase to his other hand and back. He refused to meet Claude's eyes, though Claude wasn't paying attention anyway. "Well, have a good day then," Carey said with a deflated kind of cheer. "And you too, sir." Carey hopped onto the street, crossed over to the other side, and caught sight of himself in the polished brass of the containment office sign. He looked like a fool and wanted desperately to go home. The coffee machine at Skipton House was deep inside the building, in a hallway where the lights barely functioned, and stacks of boxes overflowed with dot matrix pages all over the floor. A patchwork system of notices on the wall instructed employees how not to brew coffee, complete with a warning that 2 scoops of the Colombian dark from the mini fridge on the left might very well constitute a biohazard. Carey kept his briefcase perched between 2 fingers on each hand, waiting patiently while the quick brew light died a meandering death. The fluorescent bars above him, which had been no brighter than a candle to start, gave out midway through the process, leaving Carey in utter darkness for a few minutes, while he tried to tap them back to life with the heel of his shoe. A woman in a black skirt and a white cotton mask stared uncertainly as the light came back on, revealing Carey standing there on his toes, his worn leather loafer in his fingertips, madly swatting at the ceiling. After a moment of awkward silence, he stepped aside so she could pass. His coffee still wasn't done. Down the hall, in the great sea of cubicles that made up the first floor of the client service department, he heard the chatter of a few dozen workers speaking in calm, soothing tones to the panicked masses. "No, sir," said one woman, her northern accent cutting through the rest. "We have not absorbed the immigration office. You still need to clear things with them before filing papers with us. No, sir. I won't be able to transfer your file. They gather rather different information there. Did you? Oh, you have. And they still told you to. Right. Let me save you some time then. You're going to have to fill out a BCO-193 form and mail it in to our Liverpool branch. And they'll... Yes, that's right. 4 months. I wish I could, sir. But as you can imagine, there's a substantial backlog of late." The coffee machine beeped gently, bringing Carey back to the task at hand. He picked up his cup and turned around, carefully navigating the crowded hallways to his office in the Corporate Accountability, Foreign Affairs section. To his left spread a large room filled haphazardly with desks, stacked thick with wires, papers, and dossiers. Each of the 30-odd employees there looked up to him as he came through, nodding respectfully and muttering their good morning. Inspectors in a way that was not entirely convincing. Carey tried waving to them, but the motion spilled coffee on his hand. His eyes twitched at the heat, and he smiled weakly before darting into his office. He set the cup down on his desk, sloshing even more around, sucking the drops of coffee off his hand, then clasped it tightly and tried to contain himself. His flailing was interrupted by a sharp knock at the door that sent him scrambling for tissues, scrap paper, anything to soak up the mess. He got things reasonably tidy, leaned back in his chair, faking an expression that only half resembled authority. "Come in," he called, picking up a pen and searching his desk for a paper to be writing on, though all such papers were now in the trash. "Excuse me, sir," said a woman, leaning in through the cracked open door. "I wish this could wait. We seem to have a very serious problem on our hands, and we need your help." "What kind of problem?" Carey squeaked, motioning her to come in. She slipped into the room, and Carey immediately remembered her name, Janice. She was possibly the most gorgeous subordinate in the entire government. Carey knew her name thanks to the ID tag she wore on her too tight sweaters, which oddly reminded him of the actress in the sexual harassment video he'd been shown as part of orientation. "It's something we caught last night," she said, sitting cautiously across from him. "It might be nothing, but then you wouldn't be in here with that look on your face," Carey interrupted, and Janice's expression went as blank as she could manage. "Quite right," she conceded. "It's urgent. Where's that David fellow? He's your manager, isn't he? Shouldn't he be here too? I mean, not that I mind. I'm sure you're capable." Janice's eyebrow twitched. I'm sorry, sir. Didn't you hear? David had a cough last night. He's under house arrest till spring. Spring? Carrie gasped. For a cough? What do we do here in flu season? Honestly, sir, we lose half the workforce through the winter. I only clocked 6 months of time last year. The department takes it very seriously. Carrie nodded uncertainly. Well then, he said. Lacking David, I guess you'll have to walk me through this. My pleasure, sir, she said, handing him a block of pages. Carrie scanned them quickly but got nowhere. It was filled with columns of numbers and codes, none of which made sense to him. All he recognized was the subject line at the top. Zemus Pharmaceuticals, he read. I wasn't aware Zemus used foreign workers. Oh, they don't, sir, Janice said. This was sent to us by Revenue, actually. A bit outside our usual scope. They had some questions and thought we should take a look. As Janice explained further, it became clear someone was bypassing regulations to add unknown elements to the latest booster shots, unchecked. Carrie swallowed nervously. Oh, he muttered. Well then, we'll go see the director straight away, and you'll do the talking. Janice stood taller, suddenly exuding middle management confidence. And what exactly are you planning to say? Carrie asked. Janice stared down at him, jaw set. I'm going to explain that someone could very well be using Zemus's booster shot project to distribute viruses globally and unchecked. One Pisekeho, Prague, Czech Republic, November 27th. It was midday before Ava saw the peak of the church on Nepomuka, and it took another hour before it looked anything like the photo she'd carried in her wallet all these years. Even when she got the angle right, the differences were striking. The sky today was a light gray rather than bright and blue, and Ava looked nothing like her younger self, wearing a University of Paris t-shirt, plump with a hearty smile. The photo was creased and faded, worse for wear, but not as bad as Ava. She rounded the corner to Pisekeho, past a row of houses she only half remembered, and paced quickly down to number 1 with the kind of stiff-moving determination that only comes from a fear of the elements. Sometime around dawn, the weather had changed from a kind of rainy cold to a winter cold, giving Ava's exposed skin a sharp, prickling sensation that she knew would feel like a blazing fire the second she got warm, if she got warm. The last of the mud had washed off her some time ago, but it took with it whatever insulation she might have had. She leapt up the building stairs and pushed on the front door. It swung open eagerly, and Ava felt a tiny pocket of warm air blow past her, out into the rain. But beyond the threshold, it was colder inside than outside, so she dashed up the stairs to the 3rd floor, down the hall to 303, and knocked with a reddened hand. No answer. She tried again, a shiver shooting up her spine, eating away at any lingering patience. She made a fist and pounded on the door, her teeth rattling audibly. She isn't home, dear, said an old woman from next door. She peeked out of her apartment, shawl pulled around her short, thick frame. She wore glasses nearly a third the size of her face, yet her eyes were squinted like she couldn't see. Ava tried to control her breathing so she could speak clearly, but had little luck.
How long has she been gone?
She called out feebly. The woman cocked her head, came out into the hall with a cracked fiberglass cane, and wobbled toward Ava. I wouldn't know, dear. I don't like to snoop, but I remember that young fellow from this morning was knocking at the door like such a madman, I nearly called the police. The woman paused a short distance away, inspecting Ava carefully. "You look cold." Ava closed her eyes, thinking of warm places. I had to walk from the train station," she said. "It's raining." "Poor thing," the woman said. "Here, take my shawl. You don't want to catch a cold in a place like this." Ava put out a hand, smiled weakly. No, thank you," she said. "Too wet right now. I just have to get inside and warm up." "Inside? Do you know Mrs. Kolikoff? I didn't know she..." The woman gasped. "Oh my. You're not Eva, are you?" Ava winced at the woman, then nodded. "Oh, my dear. I had no idea. In the photos you always look so radiant and..." She trailed off, realizing what she was saying. Ava laughed. "Been a hard few years," she said. "For us all." The woman sighed. She reached out her hand, stepping back into polite society. "I'm Bachida Novacek. I live next door. It's so wonderful to finally meet you." Ava took the woman's hand with icy fingers, shaking gently. "Hi," she said, then pulled her arm back in a vain attempt to stay warm. Mrs. Novacek rubbed Ava's shoulder with the air of a kind grandmother. "You must have been out there a long time to be this wet. Why don't you come to my place and warm up?" Ava shook her head. "No, really, it's okay. I just really want to get inside. Did my mother leave a key around here? Under the mat or something?" She collapsed against the door as a shiver swarmed over her, pressing her head down and shutting her eyes tight, trying to write it out. But before long, the weight of the past few days slammed into her, and she started sobbing uncontrollably, one hand covering her eyes, the other desperately trying to twist the doorknob. A warm hand rubbed her back, up and down, and she felt a comforting nudge under her arm. "Come along, dear," the old woman said. "Let's get you fixed up." Ava stumbled, head sunk low, into the humid, homey embrace of Mrs. Novacek's living room. She was guided onto a too-soft sofa, between a pair of ochre and mustard knitted pillows, a warm blanket wrapped over her shoulders. It took her a full minute to control her crying. "I'm all wet," she said, keeping her eyes to the ground. "Things dry," Mrs. Novacek said, digging under a pile of blankets, hunting for the second of a pair of thick, furry slippers. "When did you eat last?" "I can't eat now. Too cold." "Tea, then." She shuffled off into the kitchen, cane creaking with each step. The living room was packed, but tidy. There were countless photo frames lining every available surface, showing a full range from glossy color to dusty black and white. A handful of frames lined with wilted flowers sat apart from the rest, a single scented candle burning before them. Above the fireplace was a large painting, done in oils, from Place de l'Alma in Paris, looking over the Seine. The sky was a rusty color, not the merciless bright orange that came in more recent days. Ava knew the image intimately. "You have one of my paintings?" she called out. "Your mother gave it to me. She's very proud of you, dear. It's not every child who's so gifted in the arts. My late sister had 2 of your paintings in her dining room. She loved them so much. When they unseal the house, I'll see if I can't spirit them away." "How bad is it here?" Ava asked. "News is hard to come by on the outside." As they talked, the warmth of the tea helped Ava think clearly again. Then a sudden realization struck her. "That's it," she gasped, quickly putting her tea down. Keeping the blankets wrapped tight around her, she scurried to the balcony and leaned over the edge, peering down the row. A smile grew on her face as she turned to Mrs. Novacek. "My mother never locks the balcony door," she exclaimed. "If I can swing around this partition, I can get in through the back." Mrs. Novacek observed the situation through her thick glasses. "I think you ought to wait for her to get home," she said. But Ava had already climbed onto the balcony ledge, holding the partition tightly with reddened fingers. She glanced down below. 3 stories. Gardening tools lay scattered. A rake, a push lawn mower, pruning shears, half buried in leaves. Her sneakers slid slightly on the ledge. She swung around in a quick motion, landing hard on her mother's balcony. She toppled to the ground but got up awkwardly, brushing dirt off her knees. Giving the sliding glass door a little nudge, she felt it slide open easily. "I'm great, Mrs. Novacek. No trouble at all. I just..." Her voice trailed off into nothing as she stepped inside and saw the blood splatter on the kitchen wall. One Pisekeho, Czech Republic, November 27th. "Hold on a second," Ava called to Mrs. Novacek, stepping carefully into the apartment. It was cold inside, dry like the inverse of Mrs. Novacek's place. The walls were stark and bare, the glass-topped coffee table coated in a solid layer of dust. At the division between the living room and the kitchen, Ava spotted the glistening remnants of a pair of wine glasses, the white carpet-stained burgundy next to a dried pool on the tile floor. A knife lay on its side on a cutting board, a rotting carrot half chopped and alone on the counter. Ava rounded it without breathing, her eyes locked on the blood sprayed across the far wall, dripping down along the baseboards into an area she couldn't, and didn't want to, see. She hesitated before stepping closer. A thick pool of blood, glossy and half-dried, had been rubbed across the clean tile floor. But no body. Nothing at all, as if someone had bled that much standing up, then simply walked away, leaving only a fading set of footprints leading to the front door and beyond. Ava touched the toe of her shoe to the pool of blood. It stuck slightly, but not much. She rubbed it off against the clean tile beside her and looked around anxiously. "Mama?" she called out into the flat. A sharp echo answered her. She padded carefully down the hallway to her mother's bedroom on the right, peering in cautiously. Holding her breath, she listened for any sign of life. She reached in, flipped on the light, and saw nothing but more of the same sterile blankness. The bed was made up the way it always was. Further down, in the bathroom, Ava instinctively switched on the heat as she entered. The thermostat clicked quietly, and the baseboard heaters rumbled awake from a year-long slumber, sending the smell of hot metal into the air. Aside from the medicine cabinet being half open, there was nothing of note. The expired prescription bottles remained neatly arranged, labels outward. The shower mat drooped neatly over the edge of the bathtub. The last room at the end of the hall had once been Ava's, briefly. But when she opened the door, none of her old belongings remained. Instead, a heavy oak desk dominated the space, covered in scattered papers, folders, and random stationery. A laptop screen peeked through the mess, its base buried beneath a sea of documents. Hulking bookshelves overflowed with medical journals, binders of reports, and university textbooks Ava had never seen before. The floor, too, was littered with crumpled notes and sketches, molecules, DNA strands, coded scribblings in her mother's handwriting. Ava stepped carefully, a red pen cracking under her foot as she moved toward the small end table that held a thick cardboard box. There was a smear of blood on the side, the bottom corner badly bashed in, crumpled. Inside, she found a dozen smaller boxes, about the size of a soda can, labeled in Finnish, French, and Russian. She turned one over and read the Russian text. Genesis Incubator, Refill Capsule, 220 megagrams, 55 megagrams times 4. Ava set the package down and stepped back, looking around. She dashed back to the kitchen, grabbed the phone off the wall, and turned it on. Her finger hovered over the keypad as she listened to the dial tone. She looked again at the drying blood on the floor, at her passport peeking out of her jacket pocket, stained with mud. The empty room drained the warmth from her body. She turned off the phone and set it back on the counter. Just then, a knock at the door sent her reeling back against the wall. She stayed there, silent, listening. Another knock, quick and agitated. Ava slid toward the door, her thumping heart making it hard to concentrate on the sounds beyond. She found her voice, squeaky with fear. "Hello," she called through the locked door. "Ava." Mrs. Novacek's anxious voice answered, and Ava exhaled so deeply she nearly fainted. She undid the chain, threw the lock, and opened the door just enough to peek out. "Hi, Mrs. Novacek," she said, trying to sound calm and nonchalant. "Oh, you made it. I was worried. You sounded as if something was wrong." Ava bit her lip. "Oh, I just thought the oven was left on. Optical illusion. My eyeballs are probably frozen." She forced a smile, but the half-blind old woman didn't notice. Instead, she rubbed Ava's arm kindly, patting her gently. "You look frozen, too. Go take a warm bath, dear, and stay here until your mama gets home. She'll be so happy to see you." As Ava shut the door, she looked around the desolate room. Cold, empty, alien. She shivered again. "Until she gets home," she whispered. Later, that night. Lean arms wrapped around Ava, warmer than the bathwater. She turned her head back, pressing her lips to a rough, unshaven chin. Past the scented oils, she smelled him. Familiar. She felt breath on her neck. Safe. At peace. Slowly, she drifted lower into the water. But then, he held her tight, and she smiled. "Rodri," she moaned. Then she choked on cold water. Ava sat up suddenly, her arms locking onto the edges of the tub for support. She was alone. The water was frigid. She sat there for a long moment, not moving, until the ripples stopped around her. She glanced at the empty hallway beyond the bathroom door. "Stay out of my head," she muttered to no one. She awoke sometime in the night, winded, like she'd been running for hours. Sleep wouldn't return. It took all her willpower to force down a foil-wrapped package of safe food she'd found in the closet. The wrapper boasted, "Czech government certified," which made her smile bitterly. She spent half an hour on her mother's sofa, wrapped in fleece blankets, staring at the empty fireplace. Logs sat beside it, a lighter within reach, but she didn't move to start a fire. The heaters clicked methodically as they fought against the cold. A program guide flashed onto the television screen. Easy listening music filled the silent apartment. Ava swayed slightly, her eyelids heavy, but she forced herself to stay awake. Then the news came on. "We are following a developing story at this hour," announced a pristine blonde newscaster, her cheeks still marked from wearing a filter mask. A 6-year-old boy, thought to be lost in the East End housing projects last week, has been found and reunited with his grandparents following an exhaustive police search. The boy, whose identity cannot be revealed due to patient confidentiality laws, was last seen nearly 8 days ago. According to sources, he survived on breakfast cereal in the attic of a neighboring building since his disappearance. Ava turned toward the screen. A blanket-wrapped child was carried past the cameras in his grandfather's arms. "It's a miracle we have him back," the old man said, tears in his eyes. "It must have been so hard for him, alone, out in this weather, especially after his mother." "That's all for questions," interrupted a police spokesman, shoving a hand across the camera lens. "Give them some privacy. Go on." Ava shut off the TV. The remote skidded across the floor. She exhaled long and slow. The air was still cold. A knock at the door jolted her up. She sprinted over, undid the chain, and yanked it open. "Thank God you're here, Mrs. Novacek. But it wasn't Mrs. Novacek. A heavy, gloved hand grabbed her shirt, yanking her off balance. "There you are, Miss Kolikoff," said a woman in a thick winter coat, flashing a police badge. Behind her, a broad-shouldered man loomed. "We were wondering when you'd show up." Hospital, Prague, Czech Republic. November 28th. Dr. Fanta Anuma adjusted the stethoscope on a frail, pocked arm and checked her watch with a frown. A drip of sweat trickled down her ebony skin, and she brushed it away with her free arm, careful not to touch her sterile gloves. The sound of the heaters all around the room was hard to overcome. She strained to hear, wrinkling her brow with concentration. "Know what you're doing?" asked Mr. Vakira, his voice raspy and coarse. "Shh," Anuma scolded, "or I'll have to start over." Mr. Vakira smiled at her, his patchy white beard a sharp accent to the gaps in his teeth, brown and black. His hospital gown hung on him loosely, dried blood down the front. An IV hung behind him, dripping saline slowly. Anuma flung the stethoscope around her neck and jotted on his chart with a too-short pencil. She scratched underneath her surgeon's mask with the bunched-up wrist of her glove, sighing. "Bad news?" Mr. Vakira asked, half serious. "No worse than before," Anuma replied. "Continuing this way, you will live forever." Mr. Vakira laughed loudly, and two of the patients nearest him grunted and tried to roll themselves so they'd be facing away from him. He patted Anuma's hand kindly. "You lie badly," he said, "but thank you." Anuma didn't answer, keeping her expression the same. She looked down at his chart, and he squeezed her hand to get her attention back. "Miss home?" he asked sincerely. Anuma shrugged. "I am liking it here," she said. "Your language is better. Give it another month and we won't even know you're not Czech." Anuma laughed this time, patted his arm, and put his chart back at the end of his bed. "What's it like where you come from?" he asked her. "The place I lived in Côte d'Ivoire, they call it the hot country," she said, her eyes alive, remembering. "We in the north are teased for poor constitution, how we cannot survive in but a peaceful, sunny clime. But you know, after all these years up here, in your city, Mr. Vasira, well, my friends in the south, near the ocean, they have no idea what cold really is. Having a nice breeze off the water is nothing like a day such as today." "Ah, so you like it here then?" She smiled, her mask tipping to the side. "How could I not like a place that gives me patients like you?" He beamed happily, waved her off with a shaky hand. "I'm glad you've stayed with us, Doctor," he said. "You're tougher than those Southerners could ever hope to be." "Thank you," she said with a nod. "I will be back to check you again. Soon." She pulled the curtain around his bed, letting in the full sound and sight of 400 sick and dying patients. They were grouped and partitioned by type and severity of disease, and though there were signs up to help pinpoint whichever strain you were after, anyone with a passing familiarity of modern plagues could get their bearings at a glance by the particular skin tones or the stains on the bedsheets. From the middle of the floor, the sounds of different species of moans swept past Enuma as she stood alone, the tallest thing in the rows of beds. She felt a calm breeze blow her hair across her forehead, and for a moment she swayed, smiling at the sensation, calming, quiet. But then her eyes opened, and she stared up at the ceiling, at the large fans up there, swirling slowly, picking up speed. Her breath left her. She turned quickly to the far end of the room, down by the generators, and saw a nurse playing with a long row of switches, trying to see which one powered the old X-ray machine. Enuma started to call out but clipped herself off, clenched her fists, and made a quick dash to the nurse. She slammed all the switches down with a furious hand and grabbed the nurse by the collar. "What do you think you are doing?" she hissed. "I can't figure which one turns on the—" "Take a look at the ceilings," Enuma whispered. "You've been running the fans. How long have you been at the switches?" I don't know," fumbled the nurse. "A minute? Maybe more." Enuma shook her head, squeezed back a headache. "Airflow must be restricted in this room," she said. "Our partitioning is not good enough to stop cross-contamination." "I know, You must be more careful," Enuma said, her tone softening. "If Dr. Bastian noticed this, you would be—" "Help!" came the call from the old foyer, across the sea of white linen. Enuma glanced back, then abandoned her warning and started running, stethoscope slung into her ears in mid-stride. Across the hall, Dr. Bastian was running too, tearing his gloves off urgently. A man in a work suit was leaning against the wall, a small child in his arms, wrapped in a blanket and drenched with rain. The man was panting, wheezy breaths, and looked like he'd been crying. The girl coughed loudly, and he nearly dropped her onto the ground. "Help her! I don't know what's wrong," he gasped, then collapsed down in a heap, barely keeping her frail body from slamming into the floor. Enuma slipped on a new pair of gloves, crouched down, and pulled the blanket away from the girl's face. It stuck, glued with dried pus, and the girl cried out, then coughed again. A terrible, hacking cough. "Kiev 5, Bastian muttered grimly from behind, blasting his stethoscope with disinfectant and pushing it against the girl's pocked chest. "How long has she been sick?" he asked the man. I think 3 days, he muttered, his eyes rolling back in his head. "Catch him," Bastian said, snatching the girl as Enuma gently lowered the father's head to the ground. She pried open his jacket and shirt, saw the smallest of blisters on his chest. "Cover his face with a mask and help me get the girl outside," Bastian said, pushing his white hair from his eyes. "Outside?" "We need open air," he said sternly. "She needs a bed," Enuma whispered urgently. Bastian stared at her seriously, spoke in hushed French, darting quick glances back to the sick room. "Kiev 5 is airborne at this stage. Half the people in this room would die tonight if they caught it. Even with the fans off, we cannot take that chance." "She will die out there," Enuma replied, unfazed. "She'll die in here too. Don't let her take the rest with her." A loud cry came from inside the room, weak but hysterical. "I can't die," a woman cried in French. "I can't die here." "Shit," Bastian muttered, then called out to her. "If you say one word of check about this to anyone, I'll make this girl your bedmate. Do you understand me?" There was a long silence. Yes," came the reply. Bastian nodded to Enuma. "Grab the ultrasound and meet me on the steps." As she turned toward the front of the hospital, she heard the sound of Dr. Bastian shouting. She ran to the door, pushed into the cold, wet air, and saw the old man yelling into the rain. There, in the middle of the ambulance bay, was a dark figure wrapped tight in leather and metal. Enuma gasped. A healer. Hospital, Prague, Czech Republic. November 28th. "You will not pass this door," Bastian growled. "Go back east, you monster." The healer carefully raised a hand and tapped his right temple with a finger. Enuma glanced over as Bastian mirrored the action, a faded tattoo etched on his face. 4 short bars. He touched them gingerly as if they stung. "Yes, I remember," Bastian spat. "And it won't be repeated. This is my redemption. Go kill somewhere else." Bastian picked up the girl with some effort and glanced over at Enuma. "I'll be in the back. Lock the doors behind us." "But," she started. "Do it, Fanta," he grunted. "He cannot be allowed inside." She nodded solemnly, opened the door for the old man, then crept in herself, locking the deadbolt in the middle of the paneling. The doors were thick and old, but something about the seal told her they couldn't really keep out someone determined enough to get in. She nervously glanced outside, through the tall window in the door. The bay was empty. Rain poured freely down, rushing off the faded ambulance sign like a waterfall. The backed-up drain in the center of the pavement unable to keep up with demand. The healer had disappeared. She leaned closer, trying to see around the corner. A mask shot into view, right against the window, meeting her gaze, and she yelped. Warm, processed breath hissed out of the ventilation ducts by his neck, fogging the glass in irregular bursts. Enuma recoiled, but was too scared to run. The healer stared at her dispassionately, then looked over, carefully and deliberately, to the deadbolt. Then he looked at her again. She shivered, shook her head. No. She darted her eyes over to double-check that she had really locked it. There was no movement for some time. He stepped back 1 pace, not breaking eye contact, and without warning, slammed his hand against the glass. She jumped back in shock, pushed a fist against the lock, held her breath. He was taping a paper to the window, in short, almost mechanical motions. She backed up further from the door, bumping into a gurney left on the far wall, draped with sheets to cover the bloodstains the doctors had been unable to clean off. She gripped the cold metal bars for support. Once the paper was fully fastened, the healer turned and walked away without pause. Down the steps, through the growing puddle, past the waterfall sign, and around the corner. Enuma waited another minute or two before moving forward, checking more closely. She exhaled for the first time in what seemed like hours, and pressed her forehead against the door, trying to get back her nerves. "He is gone," she said to herself. "You did fine. You did fine." She looked up, saw the poster he'd left. An information sheet in French, in clear and clinical grammar. Symptoms of a strain called LS411. How to diagnose it, how not to treat it. It was always fatal. She lightly touched her fingers against the window, her mouth falling open, and gasped at the photo of the lesions to watch for. She ran to the stairwell without a word. Franz stripped the plastic wrap from a stale hospital sandwich at the bottom of a dark green dumpster, trembling hands nearly losing the cheese and ham. He shoved it into his mouth, chewing furiously, and licked his grimy fingers, darting nervous glances out past the bags above him. "Franz!" hissed Luca, half peering over the edge inside. "Still nothing," Franz replied, trying to conceal his chewing. "Looking." Luca lifted his head a bit higher, leaned over the edge, but kept his eyes elsewhere. "Not that," he whispered urgently. "You have to see this." Franz frowned, got to his feet, and stood on a crushed plastic bin for a better view. Out in the clearing, slowly pacing around the west side of Building A, was something he'd never seen before. "A healer?" Luca asked cautiously. "Looks like it," said Franz. "Quick, help me out." He landed on the wet pavement, pulling his worn hood over his hair against the rain, and joined his friend behind the dumpster, out of sight as the figure walked past. They watched him from the dank shadows, white eyes wide in fear or anger. "Come on," Franz nudged, and they followed, hands in pockets, as if on a casual stroll. The healer turned a corner, into an alley, and the two of them paused at the entrance, looking around. The street was deserted. Behind them, the forest was awash in orange leaves dissolving in the rain. Franz checked a pile of garbage, found a heavy wooden plank and an old rusted pipe in the mix. He handed the wood to Luca and motioned to head in. The healer was staring at an open window on the 3rd floor, its fire escape too high to reach. He ran his finger along the handleless metal door before him, the only break in the ominous concrete structure. He backed away carefully. Then he lowered his head, paused, and turned around to see Franz and Luca inching toward him, closing in on their prey.
"Fucking killer!"
Franz spat, swinging the pipe from side to side. "Come to finish what you started, eh?" He lashed out with the pipe at a distance, and the healer stepped back, holding his hands up cautiously, as if he were asking for peace. Still, no words, no expression to read. "Not so smug, are ya?" Lucas said, circling the healer menacingly. "Couldn't kill us all with your germs, so now you have to fight like a man." "He's not a man," Franz sneered. "A man has a soul. This is a baby killer." Luca's eyes started to water, his face twisting, and Franz gaped at the sight. Luca wiped his eyes with his sleeve furiously, choking back tears, his face turning red as anger rushed through him. "My son!" he screamed, and charged, swinging the board straight at the healer's head. The healer's hand moved fast, bracing up to deflect the blow, and the board snapped in two. The loose side flew against the wall in a shower of splinters. Luca skidded straight into the healer, who caught him by the throat with his other metallic hand, holding him tight. Luca's passion drained fast, so close to the mask, and he gasped for desperate breaths, dropping the rest of the board at his feet. The healer spoke in a raspy, processed voice. Words neither of them understood. Tears kept running down Luca's cheeks, but he never stopped staring into the empty goggles. Then, the healer cocked his head slightly and ducked out of the way as Franz's pipe swung past. It missed him, smashing into the side of Luca's face with a loud crunch. The healer dropped the body and stepped aside, facing his next opponent. Franz gasped at the sight of his friend in a pool of blood, his pipe smeared red too. He regripped the metal, inhaled slowly, letting his fury boil over. "You fucking murderer!" he screamed, and charged again, swinging madly. The healer sidestepped the attack, grabbed the pipe, and twisted. Franz felt his wrist pop, and he lost his grip, his footing. A rough hand grabbed the back of his coat, yanking him into the hospital wall. "You!" called a French voice from behind. The healer turned, seeing the metal door now open. Enuma leaned out carefully, anxiously. "This way! Hurry!" she hissed. Praha Police Station, Prague, Czech Republic, November 28th. The end of the hall was shut off with misty plastic taped to the walls, ceiling, and floor. A biohazard sticker was peeling off in the middle. Ava slowed her pace as she approached it, but the cops shoved her forward, then jerked her to a stop at a door to her right. A paper hung over the janitor sign. "Interrogation Room B," Ava muttered. "Someone sneezed in A," the female cop grunted, opening the door to a tiny room, a table improbably wedged inside a closet space. "Lucky you." Eva was thrown into the chair at the back of the table, landing with a whimper. The two cops sidled around to the far side, sat down casually, and leaned back in silence. The woman was thickly built, with a strong jaw and short hair, cut in a 5-year too late style. The man was gruff, large and balding, his brow deep. When he clenched his jaw, it almost changed the shape of his face as the bones clicked into a new arrangement. "Ms. Kolikov," began the woman, not making eye contact. "My name is Inspector Sobotka. This is Inspector Crew." You're foreign police?" Eva ventured. Crew chortled, stroking his stubbly chin. "Why? Not an immigrant, are you?" Eva met his eyes nervously. "No," she answered. "Good thing. Shouldn't be any immigrants anymore, yeah?" "No, Miss Kolikov," smirked Sobotka. "We're just your average cops, taking care of average business." Eva watched them watching her, said nothing. "Of course," mused Crew. "My papa was with the foreign police. Must have some of it in my blood, yeah? 'Cause when I saw your file going by, I said to myself, that's someone we ought to have a chat with." "I thought so too," nodded Sobotka. Maybe just common sense then," smirked Crew, leaning forward on the table so it creaked under his immense weight. "We hear you had some trouble on the train." "It was a big misunderstanding," Ava stammered. "I was just talking to this officer when someone came out of nowhere and beat him up, and..." "Killed 2 guards? Really? I had nothing to do with that. I swear." They stared at her seriously for a moment. Then Crew yawned noisily. "Let's move on. Tell us about Paris." Ava blinked. Well, I went to school there. University." "Studying what?" Sobotka queried, clicking a pen open and flipping through a few papers in a folder. "Fine arts," Ava replied. "What about computer science? I have you enrolled in that, but nothing about fine arts. That's pretty strange now, isn't it?" "I switched majors." "Interesting. What was your minor? Biology, maybe?" Ava paused, swallowing slowly. No, she said softly. I'm sorry. Hearing's going. What did you say? Crew asked, cupping his hand to his ear. I didn't study biology, Ava said clearly, then sat up a bit straighter, squinted at them like she was preparing for a storm. How long have you been making viruses? Sabatka asked. Ava didn't flinch. I don't make viruses, she replied. I'm a painter. I make... Yeah, interrupted Crew, waving his hand at her. And the hitman's not a hitman. He's a plumber. You're not the first to dream up a cover, kid. It's not a cover. I don't make viruses. I wouldn't even know where to start. Crew grunted, stood up roughly. I've got to piss, he said, slapping his partner on the shoulder. Call me when she stops lying. Sabatka eyed Ava carefully as Crew strode out of the room. She folded her hands together, leaned forward slightly. What's up with your mum? Eva looked up like she'd been run over by a car. I don't know, she said. You two were close? Yes. All that time you were roaming around Europe. She found a way to get you care packages every month. Not many parents would do that kind of thing. I guess. Ava exhaled deeply, sinking a bit lower in her chair. Sabatka leaned back, crossed her arms, stared at the wall past Ava. We heard you watching the news this morning. Did you happen to catch the story about the kid with the breakfast cereal? Ava's eyes shifted left and right. Yeah. That was us. I mean, we found the kid. Used to be. We'd be chasing murderers and thugs and thieves and such. Now we call it a victory if we find a kid who kept himself alive without our help. It's good he's alive. He's got Bond 22. A week to live, tops. Ava said nothing. Crew returned with a battered machine, dropping it onto the table. An incubator? Ava asked. Oh, so you do know about making viruses? No, What was your mum doing with a pack of refill capsules? Sabatka asked. I don't know, Ava said quietly. They pressed on, about her travels, about Rodri Tennant, her ex. Then they turned back to Paris, back to her past. You got into the University of Paris's computer science graduate program as a foreign student. At 19. That's got to say something about your skills, right? She said nothing. Why wouldn't you look at making viruses? Someone like you, with a doctor for a mum, a computer science education, and that stint in prison. Excuse me? Ava gasped, her face turning bright red. Crew smirked. Hacked a bank when you were 15, got caught, spent a year in jail for it. Those files were supposed to be sealed, Ava muttered. Things have a way of unsealing themselves when they meet the right criteria, Crew said. Then they hit her with it. The video. Time-lapse clouds, flickering text. January 8th, Modena 1. Sabatka read aloud. The greed and hypocrisy of society is a cancer on humanity which must be removed at all costs before the blah blah blah. You get the point. I don't understand, Eva whispered. Crew flipped through the timestamps. March 2nd, Graz 3. April 21st, Linz 1. July 6th, Nuremberg 5. Each time a major outbreak had followed. Then, December 1st, Prague 1. Ava stared at the screen in horror. So tell me, Ms. Kolikoff, said Crew, how are we gonna die on December 1st?